The Barton County Courthouse, located deep in the southern United States, was a monument to colonial architecture, with its imposing white columns and fluttering state flags. To many residents, the building symbolized justice and order, but to others, it stood as a reminder of a history rooted in inequality and prejudices that still lingered in modern times. Presiding over the courthouse was Judge Robert Claiborne, a man who embodied the weight of that history. A white man with neatly trimmed gray hair and a cold, calculating gaze, he ruled his courtroom with the air of a despot. Claiborne rarely smiled, and he enforced his many rules with an iron fist, especially when the defendant standing before him didn't belong to what he considered his people. His racism was never explicitly stated, but his rulings and demeanor spoke volumes. He was the kind of man who believed his skin color and position elevated him above anyone who dared challenge him, especially someone like William Stokes. William was everything Claiborne didn't expect or want to see in his courtroom. A black man, tall and radiating a quiet authority, William entered the courthouse with steady steps, wearing a tailored gray suit that fit him perfectly. His dark skin stood in sharp contrast to the courthouse's pale marble walls, a living reminder that he didn't belong in this space, at least not according to the narrow worldview of many present. The murmurs began as soon as William walked through the doors. Most of the defendants in Barton County were locals, blue-collar workers struggling to make ends meet. William, however, didn't fit that mold. His upright posture and calm demeanor hinted at a man used to dealing with far greater challenges than a mere parking violation. Judge Claiborne noticed this immediately, and irritation began to bubble beneath the surface. To Claiborne, men like William had no right to display such confidence, especially in his courtroom. "State your full name," the judge commanded, his tone clipped and authoritative. "William Stokes," the man replied, his deep voice resonating throughout the room. A palpable silence followed. Stokes's name wasn't known in Barton County, and his confident presence was drawing curious stares from every corner of the courtroom. But to Claiborne, that confidence was just another reason to put him in his place. "And what exactly is the charge against you, Mr. Stokes?" the judge asked, though his tone made it clear he didn't care about the answer. "A parking violation, Your Honor. I have evidence to show it was due to faulty signage," William said, handing over a set of documents to the court officer, who delivered them to the bench. Claiborne flipped through the papers, but his disinterest was obvious. Instead, he fixed his gaze on William, studying him as though he were a threat. "Mr. Stokes, I don't care what you think your evidence says. Here, we follow our own rules. I'm not impressed by your attitude or your arguments." A few spectators chuckled quietly, while others looked away, uncomfortable with the judge's tone. Claiborne often used this kind of language to belittle those he deemed inferior, and he didn't bother to hide his racial bias. But William didn't flinch. He met the judge's gaze steadily and replied, "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe the documents I've presented speak for themselves." William's unwavering confidence only deepened the judge's irritation. Claiborne rapped his gavel lightly, as though to assert his dominance. "And what exactly do you do for a living, Mr. Stokes?" Claiborne asked, leaning forward with a smirk that barely concealed his disdain. "I'm a federal employee, Your Honor." The silence that followed was heavy. William didn't elaborate, but the weight of his words was enough to plant a seed of doubt in everyone's mind. Claiborne, however, wasn't about to be intimidated. "Well, a federal man," the judge exclaimed with obvious sarcasm. "And what brings you to Barton County, Mr. Stokes? I suppose this isn't the first time you've thought yourself above the law." William remained calm, adjusting his tie as though the judge's words were inconsequential. "I'm here on professional matters. As for the citation, I'm confident the evidence will clarify the situation," he replied. The judge's disdain only grew. To him, a black man so articulate and self-assured was a direct challenge to his authority. "Well then, Mr. Stokes, you'd better have something truly convincing for your next hearing. Otherwise, I suggest you prepare your wallet to pay the fine." William allowed himself a faint smile, one that seemed to carry much more meaning than it let on. "Don't worry, Your Honor. I believe my credentials will be sufficiently illuminating." The court adjourned for evidence review, but the tension between William Stokes and Judge Claiborne had already ignited something greater than curiosity. William wasn't just another defendant. He was a man who refused to be diminished, no matter how hard the system tried. William Stokes sat in the corner of a modest coffee shop not far from the courthouse. He scrolled through his phone, his sharp eyes scanning through emails and schedules, his mind focused but calm. The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of cups filled the room, but William barely noticed. He was here on business, though the parking violation and the encounter with Judge Claiborne had become an unexpected detour. He thought back to the courtroom, the cold gaze of the judge, the subtle but unmistakable disdain in his voice, the knowing murmurs from the gallery. All of it was familiar to William. Growing up as a black man in a small town in Alabama, he had witnessed firsthand how power was wielded to silence, diminish, and control. But William wasn't the boy he once was. He had climbed the ranks through the federal government, first as a policy analyst, then as a division director, and eventually as the deputy director of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. His role wasn't just a job, it was a mission. William had dedicated his career to dismantling the very systems of discrimination that Judge Claiborne so clearly embodied. Back at the courthouse, the staff buzzed with speculation. The courtroom clerk, a young woman named Emily, shuffled papers while stealing glances at the courtroom door. She had been working under Judge Claiborne for 3 years and had grown used to his moods and methods, but today had felt different. "Did you see that guy, Stokes?" she asked her colleague Jerry, a middle-aged bailiff who had worked at the courthouse for over a decade. Jerry chuckled dryly. "Yeah, I saw him. The judge didn't like him one bit, not used to someone standing tall in front of him like that." Emily lowered her voice. "Do you think Stokes is really some kind of federal big shot? He seemed so composed." Jerry shrugged, but his tone betrayed unease. "Doesn't matter what he is. Around here, it's Claiborne's show. Always has been." The judge himself sat in his chambers reviewing the files on his desk, though his mind was elsewhere. He tapped his pen against the wood, irritation flickering in his expression. Who did this William Stokes think he was? A federal employee? That could mean anything. A mail carrier was a federal employee. Claiborne's ego clung to the thought, unwilling to entertain the possibility that this man could hold any position of real power. But something about Stokes lingered in his mind. The way he spoke, the confidence in his tone, the way his presence unsettled the room. Claiborne prided himself on being in control, but that composure had wavered, even if just for a moment. He didn't like it. Across town, William's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and answered, his voice calm but firm. "This is Stokes. Deputy Director Stokes, we need your input on the Shelby County case." "There's been a development," said a voice on the other end. It was one of his aides from Washington, D.C. "I'll review the briefing later today. Keep the team on standby," William replied before hanging up. As he placed the phone back on the table, a young barista approached with a fresh cup of coffee. "Sir, this one's on the house," she said, her voice slightly hesitant but kind. William looked up, surprised. "Thank you. May I ask why?" The barista smiled nervously. "I was in the courtroom earlier. I saw how you handled the judge. That kind of confidence, it was inspiring." William nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you. Confidence comes from knowing who you are, no matter the circumstances." The young woman walked away, but her words lingered. Inspiring. William had never sought recognition or admiration. His work was about justice, not ego. Yet moments like these reminded him of why he persisted. Meanwhile, the courthouse chatter continued. Jerry and Emily watched as Judge Claiborne's clerk exited the chambers, carrying a file with tight lips and a hurried step. "What's that about?" Emily whispered. "Could be the judge digging up something on Stokes," Jerry speculated. "Wouldn't be the first time he's tried to dig into someone's past to discredit them." Emily frowned. She had seen Claiborne's tactics before, how he weaponized his position against anyone who didn't bow to his authority. But Stokes didn't seem like someone whose resolve could be shaken by petty schemes. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, William sat in his hotel room, typing notes into his laptop. He knew the type of man Judge Claiborne was, and he knew the only way to confront such figures was with the truth, laid bare for all to see. The evidence for the parking case was airtight, but this wasn't just about a parking ticket. This was about setting a precedent in a place where men like Claiborne thrived on unchecked power. William's experience had taught him that battles weren't always fought in grand arenas. Sometimes, The smallest victories could have the greatest ripple effects. The stage was set. The courtroom was more than a legal arena. It was a battleground for justice, and William was ready. The day of the second hearing arrived, and the courthouse was busier than usual. Word had spread about William Stokes, the poised black man who had stood firm in front of Judge Claiborne. Spectators who rarely attended hearings now filled the gallery, whispering among themselves as they waited for the session to begin. Judge Claiborne entered the courtroom, his expression unreadable but his posture stiff with tension. He wasn't used to being the center of speculation, and the attention on this case unsettled him more than he cared to admit. However, he was determined to reassert his authority. To him, Stokes wasn't just a defendant. He was a challenge to the social order Claiborne had long upheld. When William entered, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Dressed sharply in another tailored suit, he exuded confidence without arrogance. He carried a small briefcase and greeted the court officer with a polite nod before taking his place at the defendant's table. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Claiborne leaned into his microphone. "We are reconvening in the matter of William Stokes versus the state of Georgia regarding a parking violation," he began, his tone sharp. "Mr. Stokes, I trust you've brought the evidence you so confidently claimed would clear your name." William rose from his seat, placing the briefcase on the table. "Yes, Your Honor. I've submitted additional documentation and video evidence to the court, which should clarify any misunderstandings." Claiborne arched an eyebrow but said nothing, signaling the court clerk to proceed. The evidence included a clear video of the faulty signage and statements from local residents corroborating William's claims. It was irrefutable. The judge's lips tightened as he reviewed the materials. He could see there was no room for debate, but acknowledging this openly would mean conceding a loss in front of a room full of people. He wasn't ready to let that happen. "Well, Mr. Stokes," Claiborne began, his tone laced with forced civility, "it seems your evidence is compelling. However, there's still the matter of—" But before he could finish, William interrupted. "A calculated risk. Your Honor, if I may," he said, his voice steady. "I respect this court and the legal process, but it's clear this case has escalated beyond a simple parking dispute. I'd like to address what I believe to be the underlying issue here." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Interrupting a judge was unheard of, but William's tone wasn't combative. It was resolute. Claiborne glared at him. "Mr. Stokes, I don't recall granting you permission to make a statement. With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe my statement is relevant to these proceedings and to the principles of justice this court represents," William replied. The room held its breath. Claiborne's face flushed slightly, but he gestured for William to continue, his jaw tight with suppressed frustration. William stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of his experience and conviction. "Your Honor, I've spent my career working to uphold the principles of fairness and equality under the law. My position as Deputy Director of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice is not just a title, it's a responsibility. And when I stood before you last week, I recognized something all too familiar. The presumption of guilt based not on evidence but on appearances." The room fell silent. The gallery's whispers ceased as William's words sank in. Even Claiborne seemed momentarily stunned, though he quickly masked it with a scowl. "You dare insinuate," Claiborne began, but William raised a hand slightly, signaling that he hadn't finished. "I'm not here to make accusations, Your Honor," William said calmly. "I'm here to remind this court and everyone present that justice must be blind. When bias, conscious or unconscious, enters the courtroom, it undermines the very foundation of our legal system. And I believe we're all better than that." The judge's expression darkened, but he remained silent. William's words hung in the air, challenging not just Claiborne, but the entire room to confront uncomfortable truths. Emily, the clerk, felt a surge of admiration for William. In her years working under Claiborne, she had never seen anyone confront him so directly, and with such poise. Claiborne finally spoke, his voice low and simmering. "Mr. Stokes, your position does not entitle you to lecture this court." "You're right, Your Honor," William replied. "It doesn't, but the truth does. And the truth is, this case should have never escalated to this point. The evidence speaks for itself. Justice demands that it be acknowledged." The tension in the room reached its peak. For a moment it seemed as though Claiborne might explode in anger, but instead he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said finally, His voice clipped. "The court finds the defendant not guilty. The charges are dismissed." The words were delivered with reluctance, but they carried the weight of finality. A wave of relief washed over the gallery, followed by quiet applause. William nodded respectfully and gathered his belongings, but as he turned to leave, Claiborne's voice stopped him. "Mr. Stokes," the judge said, his tone still cold, "this courtroom is not a stage for your personal crusade." William paused, looking back over his shoulder. His reply was simple, but it resonated. "Every courtroom is a stage for justice, Your Honor, and justice is never personal. It's universal." With that, he walked out, leaving Claiborne stewing in the reality that, for once, his authority had been challenged, and his bias exposed. William left the courthouse, the autumn sun casting long shadows on the pavement as he walked toward his car. The tension of the courtroom had dissipated, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in his mind. This wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice in a professional setting, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Yet something about this encounter felt different. As he approached his car, a voice called out behind him. "Mr. Stokes." He turned to see Emily, the courtroom clerk, hurrying toward him. Her face was flushed, but her expression was resolute. "I just wanted to say thank you," she began, slightly out of breath, "for what you said in there. People don't usually stand up to Judge Claiborne like that." William studied her for a moment. She couldn't have been more than 25, with a timid air that suggested she wasn't used to speaking out. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "But I wasn't trying to stand up to him. I was standing up for what's right. There's a difference." Emily hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "It's not just about today. Judge Claiborne, he's been like this for years. Everyone knows it, but no one does anything. It's like people are scared of him." "Fear is a powerful tool," William said, his tone measured. "It keeps people silent, but silence only perpetuates the problem." Her eyes met his, and for the first time she seemed emboldened. "If I gave you some information about how the judge handles cases, could you use it?" William's instincts sharpened. "What kind of information?" Emily glanced around again before lowering her voice. "He has a pattern. He's harsher on black defendants, fines, sentences, even how he speaks to them. I've been keeping track for a while now. It's subtle, but it's there." William nodded slowly. This wasn't surprising, but having tangible evidence could be invaluable. "If you're willing to share what you have, I can make sure it's put to good use, but only if you're sure. This could put you at risk." Emily straightened her posture, her resolve clear. "I'm tired of staying quiet." William handed her a business card. "Email me what you've got, and be careful." As Emily walked away, William felt a sense of purpose reigniting. This wasn't just about his parking ticket anymore. It was about accountability. Back in the courthouse, Judge Claiborne sat in his chambers fuming. His clerk had just informed him of William's official title, and the realization stung more than he cared to admit. A high-ranking federal official had been in his courtroom, challenging his authority in front of a full gallery. Worse, Claiborne knew the implications. This could bring scrutiny he wasn't prepared to handle. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the framed photographs on his desk. Images of himself shaking hands with local politicians, cutting ribbons at ceremonies, and posing with his hunting dogs. They were symbols of the power and respect he had cultivated over decades. But today, that foundation felt shakier than ever. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Jerry, the bailiff, stepped inside. "Judge, a word?" Claiborne gestured for him to enter. "What is it?" Jerry closed the door behind him, his expression serious. "You might want to tread carefully with this Stokes guy. Word around town is he's somebody important in the DOJ. If he decides to make a case out of this, it could get ugly." The judge's jaw tightened. "I don't need advice on how to handle my courtroom, Jerry." "I'm just saying," Jerry continued, his tone cautious. "He's not the type to back down. And if he's got eyes on how you run things, it might not be a bad idea to lay low for a while." Claiborne waved him off, but the words lingered. He prided himself on being untouchable, but the thought of federal scrutiny gnawed at him. Meanwhile, William returned to his hotel room, where he found a flood of emails waiting for him. Among them was one from Emily, containing a detailed spreadsheet of cases Claiborne had presided over in the past 5 years. The patterns were unmistakable. Black defendants faced disproportionately harsher penalties, and the judge's language in court transcripts revealed a clear bias. William forwarded the email to his team in Washington, along with a concise message. Investigate this immediately. We need a strategy for action. As the night wore on, William found himself reflecting on the broader implications of his experience. This wasn't just about one judge in one town. It was a microcosm of systemic issues that plagued the entire justice system, and while he couldn't fix everything at once, he could start here. The following morning, Emily received an anonymous letter in her mailbox at the courthouse. Inside was a single sentence written in bold type, "Be careful who you trust." She froze, her heart pounding. It was a warning and a threat. When she showed it to William later that day, he was unsurprised. "This is what they do," he said. "Intimidation is their weapon, but remember, truth is ours." The subplot involving Emily had become more than just a secondary thread. It was now deeply intertwined with the main narrative, adding layers of complexity to the battle William was waging. The courthouse was unusually quiet the next morning. The anticipation from the previous hearings had subsided, but an air of tension lingered. Inside Judge Claiborne's chambers, the atmosphere was anything but calm. He had received a phone call earlier, a curt, official-sounding voice informing him that a review of his cases had been initiated by the Department of Justice. While the caller hadn't mentioned William Stokes directly, Claiborne knew exactly who was behind it. He slammed a stack of files onto his desk, his frustration mounting. The idea that someone like Stokes could disrupt his courtroom and his career was infuriating. Yet, beneath his anger was a flicker of unease. Claiborne had spent decades building his reputation, wielding his power unchecked, but now he faced a threat that couldn't be dismissed or intimidated. Across town, William sat in a conference room at a local community center. He had called for a private meeting with a group of local civil rights advocates, including pastors, lawyers, and activists. Emily was there too, her face pale but determined. "Thank you all for coming," William began, his voice steady. "What we're dealing with here isn't just about one judge or one courthouse. It's about a system that's allowed people like Judge Claiborne to operate without accountability for far too long." The group nodded in agreement, their expressions serious. Emily cleared her throat. "I've been working for Judge Claiborne for 3 years. I've seen how he operates, how he treats people differently based on their race. It's subtle, but it's there. And I've kept records, case files, transcripts, sentencing data. It's all in here." She placed a thick folder on the table. The room went silent as everyone processed the significance of her contribution. "Emily's courage is exactly what we need," William said, looking around the table. "But this isn't just about evidence, it's about building a case that's impossible to ignore. If we can show a pattern of bias, we can push for his removal and spark a broader conversation about judicial accountability." One of the lawyers, a middle-aged man named Marcus, leaned forward. "You're playing a dangerous game, Stokes. Claiborne isn't just a judge. He's a pillar of this community. People will defend him no matter what evidence you bring. Are you prepared for that kind of backlash?" William met his gaze without hesitation. "I've faced backlash my entire life, Marcus. I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make change." That afternoon, William filed an official complaint with the DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility, citing documented patterns of bias in Judge Claiborne's rulings. The submission included Emily's records, local testimonies, and corroborating data gathered by William's team in Washington. It was the kind of complaint that couldn't be ignored, especially given William's position. The news broke quickly. Within hours, local media outlets picked up the story, and whispers about Judge Claiborne's potential misconduct began spreading throughout Barton County. The judge, furious and panicked, called an emergency meeting with his attorney and a few key allies. "This is a witch hunt," he growled, pacing his office. "They're trying to destroy my career based on baseless accusations." His attorney, a composed man in a navy suit, raised a hand to calm him. "It's not baseless, Bob. The evidence is compelling and it's coming from the DOJ. You need to think strategically." Claiborne glared at him. "Strategically? You mean roll over and let them ruin me?" "No," the attorney replied, his tone firm. "But if you fight this the wrong way, you'll make it worse. You need allies, people who'll vouch for your character, who'll say this is a smear campaign." The real turning point came during a town hall meeting later that week. What had started as a routine community gathering turned into a heated forum about judicial bias and systemic racism. William had been invited as a guest speaker, and his presence drew a packed crowd. He stood at the podium, his calm demeanor commanding attention. "I didn't come here to talk about Judge Claiborne," he began, his voice steady but resolute. "I came here to talk about justice, real justice, the kind that doesn't depend on the color of your skin or the power you hold, the kind that treats every person with dignity and fairness." The audience erupted into applause, but William raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "This isn't about one man," he continued. "This is about all of us, about what we're willing to tolerate, about the kind of community we want to build. Change doesn't happen because we wish for it. It happens because we demand it." At the back of the room, Claiborne stood in the shadows, watching. He hadn't planned to attend, but curiosity and anger had drawn him there. Seeing William on stage, commanding the respect of the crowd, made his blood boil. For the first time in his career, Claiborne felt powerless. As the meeting ended, a reporter approached William, microphone in hand. "Mr. Stokes, do you think this case could lead to broader reforms in the justice system?" William smiled faintly. "I think this case is a reminder of something we all know but sometimes forget, that justice isn't a given. It's a fight, and every fight starts somewhere." In that moment, the tide had shifted. What began as a parking ticket had evolved into a battle for systemic change, with William at the forefront and Claiborne caught in the storm. The fallout from the town hall meeting was immediate and far-reaching. Local news outlets broadcast highlights of William's speech, and clips of his powerful words circulated widely on social media. The small courthouse in Barton County suddenly became a focal point of national attention, with reporters swarming the town and residents taking sides. Judge Claiborne was no longer just a respected or feared local figure. He had become the face of judicial bias in America, his name synonymous with the systemic inequalities that activists like William were determined to expose. The courthouse staff had grown uneasy. Conversations that once revolved around routine cases now centered on the storm surrounding Claiborne. Emily, who had returned to work despite the ominous warning she'd received, noticed the tension in every interaction. "You're brave to keep coming in," Jerry told her one morning as they passed in the hallway. Emily shook her head. "It's not bravery. It's necessity. If we don't stand up, nothing changes." Jerry nodded, but his face betrayed doubt. "Just watch your back. People like Claiborne don't go down without a fight." Indeed, the judge was preparing for battle. In his chambers, he and his attorney devised a strategy to regain control of the narrative. "We'll paint this as a political attack," the attorney suggested. "You've served this community for decades. Remind people of that." Claiborne scowled but agreed. He began giving carefully crafted interviews to sympathetic local outlets, portraying himself as a victim of an overzealous federal bureaucracy and a smear campaign led by outsiders. Meanwhile, William's work intensified. With the support of Emily and his DOJ colleagues, he delved deeper into Judge Claiborne's record. The more they uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Disproportionate sentences for black defendants, dismissive language in court transcripts, and a glaring lack of accountability. One case in particular caught William's attention. A young black man named Darnell Wright had been sentenced to an unusually harsh prison term for a nonviolent offense. The evidence against him had been thin, but Claiborne's scathing comments during sentencing had ensured a maximum penalty. William arranged to meet Darnell's family at their modest home on the outskirts of town. Darnell's mother, Clara, welcomed him with a firm handshake and weary eyes. "Mr. Stokes, I appreciate you coming," she said, motioning him to sit. "I've been saying for years that what happened to my son wasn't right. Nobody listened until now." William listened as Clara recounted the trial in heartbreaking detail. Her words painted a vivid picture of a young man whose life had been derailed by a system designed to work against him. "I'm not just fighting for Darnell," Clara said, her voice trembling but strong. "I'm fighting for every mother who's lost their child to this broken system." Her resolve bolstered William's own. He promised to do everything in his power to revisit Darnell's case as part of the broader investigation into Claiborne's conduct. As the investigation progressed, Barton County found itself deeply divided. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with signs reading, "Justice for all," and "Claiborne must go." Activists from nearby cities joined local residents in demanding accountability. But not everyone supported the movement. A counter-protest formed across the street with Claiborne's supporters holding signs proclaiming, "Support our judge," and "Stop the witch hunt." Many of them saw Claiborne as a symbol of tradition and stability, unwilling to believe the evidence presented against him. Tensions boiled over one afternoon when a heated argument between protesters turned physical. The scene quickly escalated, with police stepping in to separate the groups. William watched the footage later that night, his heart heavy. He had hoped this fight would unite people against injustice, but instead, it had revealed how deeply entrenched the divisions were. In his private moments, Judge Claiborne felt the weight of his unraveling career. The accusations had begun to spread beyond his courtroom, with reporters digging into his personal life and finances. Allegations of unethical behavior, including favoritism and misuse of court resources, began to surface. One morning, his attorney arrived with grim news. "The DOJ has formally requested your suspension pending the outcome of their investigation. The State Judicial Review Board is considering their recommendation." Claiborne slammed his fist on the desk. "They can't do this. I've given my life to this community, and now the community is questioning what kind of life you've given them," the attorney replied bluntly. Emily, though still cautious, had grown bolder. She began attending protests after work, standing alongside activists and sharing her experiences with reporters. Her courage inspired others within the courthouse to speak up, including a junior prosecutor who confirmed witnessing similar patterns of bias in Claiborne's rulings. The movement was gaining momentum, and William knew they were nearing a tipping point. Back in Washington, William's colleagues at the DOJ recognized the significance of the case. It wasn't just about removing one biased judge. It was about sending a message that the system could and would hold its own accountable. Reports of the investigation began influencing other counties, with activists and journalists scrutinizing local judges and exposing similar patterns of discrimination. What started in Barton County was spreading, and William felt a sense of vindication. The consequences of William's efforts were becoming clear. Judge Claiborne's reign was crumbling, but the fight was far from over. The days following the protests were a whirlwind of activity for William. His role had shifted from being a federal official, managing an investigation, to becoming a symbol of resilience and accountability for the community. The weight of the movement he had helped ignite was heavy, but it also brought clarity to his mission. As he sat in his hotel room one evening, reviewing the latest updates from the DOJ, his phone buzzed with a call from Marcus, the local civil rights attorney who had been assisting him. "William, you might want to hear this," Marcus began. "I just got word that the Judicial Review Board has scheduled a preliminary hearing to address the complaints against Claiborne. It's happening next week." William nodded, his expression firm. "Good. The sooner this gets to a hearing, the better. But we can't stop now. We need to ensure the evidence speaks louder than any defense Claiborne might bring." "We're with you," Marcus assured him. "The community is ready to stand up too. You've shown them what's possible." After ending the call, William leaned back in his chair. He had faced battles like this before, but something about this fight felt personal in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about dismantling a corrupt judge's career. It was about proving to himself and to others that change was achievable even in the face of deeply entrenched prejudice. In his own home, Judge Claiborne prepared for the upcoming hearing with the tenacity of a man desperate to protect what remained of his legacy. His attorney had gathered letters of support from prominent community members, including local business owners and politicians. "We'll argue that the accusations are politically motivated," the attorney explained. "The people accusing you have an agenda. We can frame this as an attack on traditional values." But Claiborne's confidence was waning. The scrutiny had taken a toll on his reputation, and the weight of the evidence against him was undeniable. Deep down, he knew this fight wasn't just about his career. It was about the ideology he had built his life upon. The night before the hearing, William found himself alone at the community center where he had held his first meeting with local activists. He walked through the empty space, the echoes of past conversations filling his mind. His thoughts drifted to his childhood in Alabama. He remembered the long summer afternoons spent with his grandfather, a man who had marched in Selma and faced down fire hoses and snarling dogs. His grandfather had always told him, "The fight for justice isn't about winning every battle. It's about showing up again and again, no matter the cost." William's resolve strengthened. This wasn't just his fight. It was the continuation of a legacy, a promise to those who had come before him and those who would come after. The courtroom was packed for the Judicial Review Board's preliminary hearing. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras clicking as community members, activists, and legal professionals filled the seats. William sat at a table with Marcus and Emily, who had decided to testify about her experiences working under Claiborne. She was nervous but determined, clutching a folder of transcripts and case files that detailed the judge's bias. When the hearing began, Claiborne's attorney attempted to frame the accusations as baseless and politically motivated, but as the board members reviewed the evidence, case data, transcripts, and testimonies, it became clear that the patterns of bias were too consistent to ignore. Emily's testimony was a turning point. She spoke about the casual racism she had witnessed in the courthouse, the dismissive tone Claiborne often used with black defendants, and the disproportionate sentences he handed down. Her voice shook at first, but as she continued, she grew more confident, her words landing with undeniable weight. "I stayed silent for too long," she said, looking directly at the board members. "But I won't stay silent anymore. What's happening in that courtroom is wrong, and it has to stop." William followed, presenting the broader implications of the evidence and tying it to systemic issues within the judiciary. His words were measured but powerful, emphasizing that this case was about more than one man. It was about restoring faith in the justice system. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that Claiborne's defense was crumbling. The review board announced that they would recommend his immediate suspension, pending further investigation. The room erupted in applause as the announcement was made, and Claiborne sat silently, his face a mask of barely concealed fury and humiliation. As William left the courthouse, he was surrounded by reporters asking for comments. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't a victory for me," he said. "It's a victory for justice, for everyone who believes in fairness and accountability. But there's still so much work to be done. This is just the beginning." In the weeks that followed, William felt a profound sense of fulfillment, tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. He had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting in spite of it. And through his interactions with people like Emily and Clara, he had seen the power of collective action, the strength that came from people standing together for what was right. He returned to Washington with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to use his position to drive systemic change. But he also carried with him the stories and faces of those who had inspired him along the way. The recommendation to suspend Judge Claiborne sent shockwaves through Barton County. For many, it was a long overdue reckoning. For others, it was an attack on a beloved figure, a man they viewed as a cornerstone of their community. As protests continued to swell in the courthouse square, both sides clashed with increasing intensity. Amid the turmoil, the DOJ's investigation into Claiborne's rulings expanded. William, now back in Washington, led the effort remotely, but his presence was still felt in Barton County. His name had become synonymous with the fight for justice, and his words from the town hall, "Justice isn't a given, it's a fight," were being quoted on signs and social media. Claiborne wasn't finished. In a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, he scheduled a press conference inviting local and national media. His strategy was clear: paint himself as a victim of a politically motivated witch hunt and cast doubt on the integrity of the DOJ's investigation. The press conference took place in front of the courthouse, with Claiborne flanked by his attorney and a handful of loyal supporters. Reporters filled the steps, their cameras trained on the judge as he began to speak. "This has never been about justice," Claiborne declared, his voice booming through the microphone. "This is about power. This is about federal overreach and an attempt to dismantle the values of this community. I have dedicated my life to upholding the law, and I will not be silenced by baseless accusations." He paused, his gaze scanning the crowd, his tone growing more forceful. "I know who I am, and I know what I stand for. My record speaks for itself." Before he could continue, a voice cut through the crowd. "And that's exactly the problem." The crowd turned, parting to reveal William Stokes standing near the edge of the square. Dressed in his usual tailored suit, his calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Claiborne's fiery rhetoric. Claiborne's jaw tightened. "Mr. Stokes," he said with a forced smile, "I see you've decided to join us." William stepped forward, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I didn't come here to disrupt. I came to remind you, and everyone else, that actions speak louder than words. Your record does speak for itself, Judge Claiborne. That's why you're here defending it, instead of presiding over cases. A murmur spread through the crowd, reporters quickly turning their cameras toward William. Claiborne's face reddened. This is exactly what I mean. This man, this so-called federal official, has come to our town to undermine our way of life. He doesn't understand our community. William met his gaze unflinching. I understand more than you think. I understand what it feels like to be dismissed because of who you are, to be judged unfairly before you've even had a chance to speak. And I understand that the law isn't a tool for protecting privilege. It's a promise of equality. The crowd fell silent as William's words hung in the air. Even those who had come to support Claiborne seemed momentarily swayed. Claiborne took a step closer to the microphone, his tone biting. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Coming here, stirring up trouble, trying to tear me down. But let me tell you something. You're nothing but an opportunist. William didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he gestured toward the courthouse behind them. This building isn't yours, Judge Claiborne. It belongs to the people. And the people deserve better. The tension was palpable. Reporters leaned forward, their pens poised, capturing every word. What happened next was unexpected. A woman stepped out of the crowd, a middle-aged black woman with graying hair and a determined expression. It was Clara Wright, Darnell's mother. My son sat in that courtroom, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. And he didn't get justice. He got judgment because of the color of his skin. And now, finally, someone's standing up for him, for all of us. Her words ignited a wave of responses. Others began speaking up, sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment in Claiborne's courtroom. The atmosphere shifted as more voices joined the chorus, drowning out Claiborne's attempts to regain control. Faced with the growing wave of testimonies and the unrelenting scrutiny from the DOJ, Claiborne's composure cracked. He lashed out, accusing the DOJ of corruption and the community of betrayal, but his words only alienated him further. By the end of the press conference, it was clear that his support had eroded. The Judicial Review Board formally announced their decision to permanently remove him from the bench, citing gross misconduct and evidence of racial bias. As the crowd dispersed, William found himself surrounded by reporters once again. This time his message was clear and hopeful. This is a victory for accountability, he said. But more than that, it's a reminder that change is possible when we stand together. This fight isn't over, but today we've taken a step forward. The reporters pressed for more comments, but William excused himself, walking toward Clara. Thank you for speaking out, he told her. Your courage made all the difference. Clara smiled, tears in her eyes. You gave me the strength to do it. Thank you for not giving up. The weeks following Judge Claiborne's removal marked a turning point not only for Barton County, but for William Stokes as well. The courthouse, once a symbol of unchecked power and bias, had become a rallying point for justice and reform. Community leaders began organizing forums to discuss systemic issues, and new initiatives aimed at increasing judicial accountability were gaining traction statewide. William stayed involved from a distance, monitoring the progress while continuing his work at the Department of Justice. His efforts in Barton County had set a precedent, and similar investigations were being launched in other jurisdictions across the country. The ripple effects of Claiborne's case were undeniable, proving that even small victories could lead to significant change. Months later, William returned to Barton County at the invitation of local activists. The community center, where he had held his first meeting with civil rights advocates, was now a hub of activity and hope. The room was filled with familiar faces, including Emily, Marcus, Clara, and even Jerry, the once cautious bailiff who had quietly supported the movement. As William stepped to the podium, the room erupted in applause. He raised his hand, signaling for quiet, and began to speak. When I first came to Barton County, I was here for a simple case, a parking ticket, he said, smiling as a few chuckles rippled through the audience. But what I found was something much bigger, a community ready to stand up and fight for what's right. He paused, scanning the room. This victory wasn't mine. It was yours. It was the courage of people like Emily, who risked everything to speak the truth. It was the determination of people like Clara, who refused to let her son's story be forgotten. And it was the strength of this community, standing together against injustice. The applause was thunderous, and William felt a swell of pride. The courthouse, too, had changed. A new judge, a progressive, community-focused leader, had been appointed, and efforts were underway to ensure that the court served everyone equally. Emily had been promoted to a senior position, and she had become a vocal advocate for diversity and fairness within the judicial system. One day, William visited the courthouse to see these changes firsthand. He walked the halls, greeted warmly by staff who had once been wary of his presence. In the gallery, a group of students sat observing a case, a program initiated to teach young people about the importance of justice and accountability. As he stood there, watching the proceedings, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Later, as William prepared to leave Barton County for the final time, he met Clara for a cup of coffee. "Darnell's appeal is moving forward," she said, her voice filled with hope. "They're reviewing his case next month." William smiled. "That's the next step. And no matter what happens, remember, you've already made a difference." Clara reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "So have you, more than you know." As William drove away, the sun setting behind him, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He knew the fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that the scales were beginning to tip in the right direction. A year after Judge Claiborne's removal, the Barton County Courthouse stood as a symbol of transformation. Its once intimidating halls now bore plaques commemorating the power of community action. William Stokes watched from afar, proud of the changes that had taken root. His efforts had inspired broader reforms, with judges nationwide facing new levels of accountability. As William prepared for a DOJ meeting on systemic justice reforms, a message lit up his phone. A photo of Clara and Darnell Wright, smiling as they celebrated his release from prison. Justice, William thought, is a fight worth every battle. The story of William Stokes and his fight for justice in Barton County is more than a tale of perseverance. It's a call for all of us to take a stand. Justice isn't just about grand courtroom battles or high-profile cases. It's about the everyday choices we make to challenge bias, inequality, and unfairness wherever we see it. Now it's your turn to be part of this movement. What stood out to you in this story? Did a particular moment inspire you, frustrate you, or make you reflect? Your thoughts matter, and sharing them is how we keep these conversations alive. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to take action. Follow this page to stay connected with more stories that highlight courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Like this post to show your support for the fight against systemic injustice. And most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments. What changes do you want to see in your community? What steps are you willing to take to make them happen? By liking, sharing, and engaging, you're helping to amplify the message that justice is a fight worth waging, and one we can win together. Don't let this conversation end here. Be a part of the movement that demands fairness and accountability. Follow us today and join a community committed to making a difference, one story, one action, and one voice at a time. Let's fight for a world where justice truly is for all.